Welcome to RenewCast, the podcast of Renew Education. I'm Noah Brink. Today's conversation is going to be a bit of a bonus episode, as most of our episodes are published on Fridays. And last episode, I did mention that we would be continuing the conversation we had about a biblical anthropology. That is our intent for our episode that will come out this Friday. But I'm inserting this conversation in here just because of several of the conversations that I've had with people, things that I've been reading over the past few weeks. Now, there is some overlap here with this episode and some of the other things that we have produced, either other podcast episodes, or there is a series that I do have on our YouTube channel that I call Worldview Briefly. I only have a small handful of those episodes that are on our YouTube channel. But those videos are intended to be 5 minutes or less and to cover a very specific idea within worldview thinking, often trying to provide some kind of very clear definition to an aspect of a Christian worldview. We also have another new series that I've been producing on our YouTube channel, and there are YouTube Shorts. So YouTube Shorts are 60 seconds or less. That's one of the boundaries for them. And one of the things that I've started to do over the past couple of weeks is to produce a daily YouTube short that is just a very brief reflection on something that I've read in a book or an article or something very pithy that someone has said, and I just give a very brief reflection on it. Those always lean towards Christian worldview or Christian living, how we're supposed to live in the world in which we are. That's something that I want to offer as just here are things I'm reading, here are things that I think could be useful to further our Christian worldview, to further our love for God, to further our love for His kingdom. And so our YouTube channel does have increasing numbers of YouTube shorts. We will have even more of the Worldview Briefly episodes. And today's episode, I do want to be relatively brief, as the whole goal for today's episode is to just drill down on the notion of a Christian worldview. The reason I want to have this conversation today is it seems like I'm routinely running into conversations with people that use this idea of Christian worldview, and I don't claim to believe to have that I have it all figured out. And yet, I often find that the people I'm talking to or the things I'm reading where people mention Christian worldview, they don't seem to align very nearly with what I believe a Christian worldview to be. Now, in multiple of our RenewCast episodes, you've heard me talk about the necessity of having clear definitions. That is one of the things that I think is an absolute must, not only in our Christian schools, but in any conversations we enter into. If we use phrases as though we assume people know what we're talking about, and yet we have a very nebulous understanding of what that is, of course it's going to leak into all sorts of dysfunction. It's going to reduce clarity. It's going to reduce consistency. We need to have clear definitions. Now, yes, if I talk about Christian worldview, and I've alluded to this before, at one of the points in my journey, I was given the title of Worldview Director. And essentially because no one really knew what else to do with me. And I was teaching Christian worldview to our faculty. I think that's a big part of why they called me Worldview Director. We had a course that was a 25-hour course that was required for all of our teachers, and actually our staff in general. And I was also teaching Christian worldview to our leadership development program for students, and our 10th grade Bible class even had a Christian worldview component to it. And we had in essence built our own curriculum. I had built my own curriculum, and so there was a lot of my job that was overlapping with Christian worldview, and so I had this title, Worldview Director. And so, of course, I've read a whole lot of different things on Christian worldview. And some people say, well, Noah is a worldview guy. An interesting story is I had reached out to the Herzog Foundation. If you don't know the Herzog Foundation, I encourage you checking out the Herzog Foundation. They are a wonderfully generous and strategically thoughtful organization to further Christian education. Well, on their website, I filled out a contact form where I talked about my interest in Christian worldview and that I've had some history teaching about it. And their training director, who has a lot of influence on the resources that Herzog Foundation provides for people, her name is Sadie Elliott. Sadie reached out to me, and she has joked about it multiple times in public, where she said, here's just another worldview guy. And she very graciously reached out to me, assuming that it would just be another conversation. And I'm actually very honored that I passed the test, that she realized that my understanding of a Christian worldview is more than just sort of a hobby on the side, or I think she's also probably seen a lot of people that talk about it, and they're only beginning to scratch the surface. Lord willing, my ability, my passion for a Christian worldview came through, and I think that's part of why Sadie has continued to allow me to be a part of a small part of some of the things that Herzog does. But even in one of the recent Herzog events that I attended, where I got to be a coach, this is a training series for spiritual formation. One of the school leaders that wanted to sit down with me for a coaching session said he said that he wanted me to take a look at some of the stuff that he was building for worldview development for his faculty. And so he wanted me to kind of look at some of the slides in this presentation. And I had to pause after he showed me what he had produced, and I said, I think everything that you've produced is really good. But I don't necessarily think that's really within the ballpark of Christian worldview. These slides predominantly were sort of these creedal statements. These are some of these things that our school is going to say we believe. These foundations of the faith as understood in their school. Now, I believe that a Christian worldview requires an orthodox theological richness, that we need to have sound theology. We need to be orthodox. We need to be straight in our thinking and our articulation of what Christianity fundamentally is about. But what I said with this school leader is that a Christian worldview far too often is understood as these are the things that Christians believe. And a Christian worldview is not merely what Christians believe. It's because the idea, once again, worldview, it comes from a German word, Weltanschauung. It's this idea of an outlook on all things. So a worldview is not merely what we believe, it's how we view things in light of what we believe, how we live in light of what we believe. It's a position of application. It's a position of embodiment. Because you could believe certain things, but live inconsistently with that, and it would be difficult to say that that is the Christian worldview. And unfortunately, I do believe that for many of the years of the development of Christian worldview thinking, we did reduce it to thinking specifically, this idea of a cognitive discipline, as though worldview is predominantly an intellectual endeavor. And I'm appreciative for James K.A. Smith's work, Desiring the Kingdom, the first book, and then the following books, and many of the other things he's written since then, where he talks about the notion that for us, in many cases, Christian worldview is almost like an adverb, that we want to talk about literature Christianly, or engineering Christianly, or medicine Christianly, that it's merely a perspective. And one of his points is that we are more desiring beings than thinking beings. And what he means by that is that our emotions often, and our desires and our longings and our loves actually are held more deeply than our ideas. And so if we're going to truly press into the notion of Christian worldview, we need to not just target our ideas, but we also need to target our loves, because what we love and what we desire, that truly is going to affect our worldview. It is going to affect our perspective. It is going to affect how we view and embrace and imbibe and live in the world in which we live. And so I think that it's important for us to continually expose ourselves to some of these worldview conversations. But as I said with this school leader, like I said, that it's so much more important to say, not just here's what we believe, but how does what we believe influence the way we think and the way we emote and our affections and our longings and all those kind of ideas. I also believe that you have several of these studies out there that talk about the really poor numbers of people leaving our schools, or adults that have weak Christian worldviews, or poorly developed Christian worldviews, and different worldview assessments or worldview studies or surveys. And there are a handful that are out there, and some of them are better than others. But many times I feel like these worldview assessments, these worldview surveys, or these attempts to try to understand worldview, they primarily get to, what do you believe? Now, granted, like I said, obviously what you believe is an important part of a Christian worldview. And obviously, if you don't believe that Jesus is God, you could say that the person doesn't have a Christian worldview. But merely saying that someone actually has these beliefs that, yes, I should care about the poor, but then in terms of the day-to-day, in no level demonstrates concern for the poor, I would say that's not really a well-developed Christian worldview. Or a person believes in the virgin birth. And obviously all of those are really important things. And so some of these studies that have talked about worldviews, yes, they're starting points. And I would say we probably need to just leave them there. If the Barna studies say that there are this many people, that staggering numbers of people that don't have a Christian worldview that claim to be Christian, obviously those numbers are concerning. But what I would say is, of the people that checked the right answer, I would actually probably press in saying the numbers are probably lower because they may check the right answer because they know what they're supposed to believe. To what are the primary doctrines of Orthodox Christianity. But in terms of thinking through the day-to-day of those and living those out, I would say they may or may not actually know what that looks like. So I think it's important when we talk in our schools about Christian worldview that we begin to help our school and our community say it goes beyond mere orthodoxy. And that's where I think this idea of orthodoxy and orthopraxy and orthopathy go hand in hand. So orthodoxy, the root there is this notion of thinking straight, or be a straight voice, that what you believe, what you know to believe be true is straight, that it's orthodonture. This idea of straight, that you believe what you're supposed to. And so biblical orthodoxy is it's aligned with what the Bible says. It's straight. Now, orthopraxy would be straight action, that we actually have put those things into practice, that we do those things we say we believe. I recently read a wonderful article by Abram Van Ingen, who's a professor of literature at Washington University in St. Louis, in which he says theology is actually supposed to be lived out. That's the whole purpose of theology. So this idea that orthodoxy should lead to orthopraxy, so straight thinking should lead to straight action, but I would add on to it as well that it should then as well lead to orthopathy. So pathos gets into the emotions and the affections, so that not only should we have straight ideas and straight action, but our desires should be straight. We talk also about the idea of head, heart, and hand. So orthodoxy, orthopraxy, orthopathy, head, heart, hands, this idea of these three parts of our being. I think a Christian worldview, it's going to have to incorporate all three of those. So, and even Jesus says that when he says we're supposed to love God with all of our heart and our mind and our strength. It's taking the full person, not just the intellect of your head, that we love God with our minds. And I appreciate the book, Love the Lord Your God with Your Mind, because part of the fear there, or of the scandal of the evangelical mind by Mark Knoll, where he says the scandal is there is no evangelical mind. That Mark Knoll was trying to press into this notion that Christians have stopped using their brain, that the idea of being a Christian intellectual has not been a desirable pursuit. And I think the pendulum swung some, that we became more focused on the intellect and maybe not enough on the affections. And I think we all understand that a Christian worldview, it's going to have to incorporate all of the person, the whole person, our head, our heart, and our hand, orthodoxy, orthopraxy, orthopathy, our soul, mind, and strength. So I think that those are all important parts of the conversation too. And I do think it's probably tough even to assess that, because an assessment, how are you going to assert in the person's emotions and longings and affections and loves being what they're supposed to be, or even their actions? It's far more complicated. But I do think it's important to have a definition. One of the definitions that I use and I keep taking people back to is that I believe that a Christian worldview is the ability to make sense of the world in light of the gospel. That we are filtering what we see and we are engaging, and maybe you could even say it's the ability to make sense of and then engage the world in light of the gospel. If we wanted to be even a little more active, that having a Christian worldview means that we are engaging the world, we're thinking about the world, we're understanding, so make sense. That's the reason I use that phrase. That it's not just looking at it, it's making sense of it, it's understanding it. And specifically in light of the gospel. The gospel, this very critical, central, core truth to Christianity, this notion that you and I can never do enough to save ourselves. We are entirely dependent upon grace, And grace has come to us because a person, God himself, entered into this world and lived a perfect life and died and took our sins on himself and rose again victoriously. But it goes back to that first thing I said, that we can't do enough to save ourselves. This idea, I can't and he can. And maybe that's even a simple distillation of the gospel. I can't, he can. Viewing the world, viewing all things, making sense of, engaging the world, everything in light of the gospel. Not necessarily in terms of biblical truth, because some people define a Christian worldview that way, that they would find a biblical truth and therefore a Christian worldview. That they found a place in the Bible that talks about women should keep their heads covered. Therefore, having a biblical worldview means that we need to keep our heads covered. Or the Bible talks about this being sin or this not being sin. And we think about these different things the Bible says do's or don'ts, and we need to be able to say, where is that in line with the gospel? Is that consistent with the gospel? Is it not consistent with the gospel? Where's the gospel here? What difference does the gospel make? And I think it's important for us to view, to make sense of, to look at all things in light of the gospel. And as a result, a Christian worldview is a lens. It's looking at the world. It's looking at the world through a filter. It's understanding through that. It's not a fence. And I think that far too often Christianity and a Christian worldview is seen as a fence. There are a lot of worldview conversations that I've seen, and predominantly they are, let's point out all of the bad things about this other culture. A very well-known Christian worldview textbook that a lot of Christian schools use for their worldview classes, the bulk of the class is, here are the different isms that are out there, and it tries to equip people to know how to recognize those isms in the culture. I think that's a wonderful discipline, by the way. I think it's very important for me to be able to recognize what is Marxist or what is pragmatist or what is relativist or the different isms and ists. It's very important to be able to recognize those things and to see that. But what I would say is it's even more important that we understand what the Christian worldview is, and we begin to say, how does that Christian worldview affect my approach to all things? And so it's not just a fence, it's a lens but it requires, yes, we have orthodox Christian beliefs, but we begin to think about how does that affect our approach to the world? How does it affect our ability to make sense of the world? How do we see ourselves? How do we see the world? How do we see the furthering of Jesus' kingdom in light of the gospel? It's not a fence, it's a lens. And I think that's important even there because, as David Kinnaman mentions in his book, Unchristian, that it is very, very easy for the onlooking world to know Christians first and foremost by what we're against rather than by what we're for. And it's a fascinating sociological study, this book, Unchristian, by David Kinnaman, where he says that after doing lots of surveys, he said it became pretty clear to him that seemed to be a predominant view of non-Christians towards Christians, that they know Christians more by what they're opposed to than by what they're for, because that tells you right there what we spend most of our time talking about. It's not what we actually believe to be true and are clinging to, life and death clinging to, but we spend most of our time talking about all the things we're opposed to. See, I think that having a Christian worldview wouldn't merely point out the bad things in the culture. It would also point out the good things and would be just as excited to point out about the good things and maybe even more excited to point out the good things than being critical of the bad things. Because it's a lens. I mean, love thy neighbor. If I'm going to truly love my neighbor as myself, I should be rooting for him. I should be actually, and to love him doesn't mean just to point out all of his errors. It's to celebrate and talk about the dignity that person has. It's not just the criticism. And I think that we have far too many models of that we think that's what a Christian worldview is. Know what all the isms are out there, know a bunch of biblical truths, and then watch the collision between the two. No, a Christian worldview is, how do we make sense of? Because, by the way, if I believe the gospel really is going to prohibit my ability to condescend. It's going to cause me to think of myself in terms of a profound need for Jesus, and it's going to cause me to love my neighbor because I realize that even though God has been gracious in his pursuit of me, I need Jesus just as much as that person does. And how does that begin to affect my approach towards all things? I think it's really interesting. Another sort of worldview quote that I love is from Francis Schaeffer, where he says that true spirituality is all of life after that which is contrary to the character of God is removed. We have this tendency within Christian circles to reduce sort of our perception of all things into these nice little neat categories of good, bad, and neutral, as though there are those things which are clearly Christian, those things which are clearly bad, and then everything else is neutral, and as though that's a Christian worldview. And I appreciate Schaeffer's statement where he says, actually, it's all of life after that which is contrary to the character of God is removed. What that means is remove whatever is contrary to God's character, and we know what those things are. The Bible tells us very clearly who God is and what he delights in. Remove those things, and everything else is truly spiritual. So music is not neutral, art is not neutral, play is not neutral, recess is not neutral, literature is not neutral. That remove what's contrary to the character of God, and everything else is truly spiritual. And that allows, I think, the Christian to even embrace the world with a greater delight, to find a flourishing wholeness as we approach the world around us. Getting rid of some of those categories. It's like, what is contrary to God's character? And everything else is something that Christians can say, God has revealed himself here. But in order to be able to make sense of the world in light of the gospel, I think it is important that we have some categories we use. And that's one of the big things that Renew Ed spends our time doing, is trying to provide categories. I think there are lots of categories. We have what we call our worldview grid. And I think that it's been very helpful for us as we try to walk alongside with people to say, here are some of these big buckets that we need to be bringing. It's kind of like the tools in our tool belt. These are the tools that we need to be bringing with us when we begin to try to make sense of the world in light of the gospel. That we need to be able to think creationally and think in terms of the fall and think in terms of redemption and think in terms of truth. I mean, some of these big categories, which, by the way, all worldviews deal with those big categories. But for us to be able to say, how do I make sense of the world in light of the gospel? That's why we built the worldview grid that we use, which, by the way, that is something that we love to be able to enter into conversations with. If you are working for a Christian school or you are in a church context and you're saying, we could really use a lot of help as we begin to try to process through, how do we do a better job of both understanding, but then articulating and applying a Christian worldview, we would love for you to use our worldview grid. That's the reason we developed it. We hope that it can be a resource. It's on our webpage, www.renew-education.org. It's very much knit into the fabric of these RenewCast episodes. We believe that it's important for us to say, well, what would be those big questions that are going to help us make sense of the world in light of the gospel? To be able to see life is truly spiritual once we remove those things which are contrary to God's character. And to begin to very clearly and loudly be able to proclaim what we are for rather than what we're against. That's one of the reasons why I felt it would be good for us to even just pause and say, so you hear us talk a lot about Christian worldview at Renew Education. That's what we mean when we talk about Christian worldview. It's the ability to make sense of the world in light of the gospel. And it doesn't happen overnight. It's something that we constantly have to take time to do. It takes a lot of work. It's something that I continue to say, how is my belief in the gospel continuing to shape my approach towards all things? And to ask questions, it requires a lot of reading, it requires a lot of work, and at times the answers aren't so simple. But even there, that's another reason why we believe the gospel, because Jesus came because we don't have all the answers. If we did have all the answers, we wouldn't need Jesus. So that's why the gospel, even there, is good news for us. It's the ability to make sense of the world in light of the gospel. I hope that's a helpful resource for you, and we'll continue to do everything we can to be resources for you in whatever context that means. Thanks for listening, and we truly do look forward to next time.
Thanks for listening to RenewCast. You can subscribe to our show at Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcast episodes. Visit our website at www.renew-education.org to learn more, or follow us on our YouTube channel.